Hello and welcome to the show. Thank you for being here. I'm your host, Rachel Lang, and today's episode is one that you're probably going to want to bookmark and send to your friends and refer back to it over the next few months and maybe even over the next year. We've talked a lot on this show about the astrological changes that await us in 2025 and 2026, with Neptune moving into Aries, with Uranus moving into Gemini, Pluto in Aquarius. We have a lot of outer planet changes, and that corresponds to cultural shifts, societal changes, global events that we are going to witness and experience in our world. So I invited my friend, colleague, one of the most well-respected and visionary astrologers of our time, Samuel Reynolds, onto the show. And he and I are going to engage you in a conversation about some of these changes, about the US presidential election and what we might see as a fallout of that election, and how that relates to our astrology. Sam is one of the most respected astrologers. He has a good way of just making the spiritual and the cosmic very practical so that you can understand the language that we're speaking in a way that relates to your life. Sam is one of the most well-regarded teachers of our time. He is an internationally renowned speaker, and he has a real engaging social media presence too. So you need to check him out. You need to follow him. Before I get into my conversation with Sam, I just wanted to remind you that my Shift Network course is coming up. It starts on November 25th, and it is Empower Your Psychic Mediumship Through Astrology. So it's a course that intersects astrology with psychic mediumship that helps you to develop your own inner guidance and your own intuition, and to learn how to trust the signs and the signals that you receive. Also, you'll learn how to approach astrology in a way that incorporates your psychic awareness, and hopefully lean into your chart to discover new access points to working with your intuition, to developing more of a psychic mediumship practice. So that's coming up, and there are links down below to all of the things that we talk about in this website, and including this course. Very excited about this, and there is no better time to be accessing more of your inner voice than a time when the outer voices that we have access to feel very inconsistent and we have a hard time knowing what's true and what's not. So please check out that course, sign up, and if you can't make it live for every Monday over the next 7 weeks, then you can get the recordings. And also, there will be opportunities to build community and to practice working on your psychic mediumship with other people as well. So that's coming up. Very, very excited about that. Speaking of shift, we are living through a time of a shift in consciousness, an upgrade in consciousness, even though sometimes it doesn't quite feel like that. So what do the transits of this moment have to say about the US presidential election? How did Mars and Pluto come into play? What about the role of men in this election process? These are some of the questions that I explore with Samuel Reynolds. And so help me in giving him a very, very warm welcome. Welcome, Sam, to the show. So, Sam, it is so great to be with you today. And I'm so happy that you're here for our conversation.
Thank you for having me, Rachel. I'm happy to be here.
I have a lot that I want to talk to you about. I sent you this whole list of topics and questions that, it's pretty ambitious. So we'll cover as much as we can. But I really wanted to start with a little bit of your story. And that's because you're a great example of how someone can be really skeptical about astrology and look at astrology and that you over time became a believer. So can you talk a little bit about the transition that happened for you when you went from debunking it, being a skeptic, to where you are now?
Well, yeah, sure. I usually skip a step, so I'm actually going to put in this step this time. So I used to be a fundamentalist preacher. And I started early. I started when I was 12. I preached my
Wow.
first sermon on my mother's birthday, September 28th, 1980. And so I, as a fundamentalist, had an aversion to astrology initially for religious reasons. But I'm also born on the putative cusp between Scorpio and Sagittarius, November 22nd. And when I would read materials about either sign, Scorpio or Sagittarius, it was more confusing for me because I felt like I had dimensions of both, sometimes neither in terms of those things. So between that confusion and then what I felt the Bible said about astrology, it became easy for me to quote unquote hate and be dismissive of it. So that was true pretty much from 12 to 19, where I started to question my faith and deal with that aspect of skepticism related to my faith. And then from that, it was easy to kind of bleed into looking at things from an atheistic, empiricist point of view, which everything became for me at that time at 19, 20, race, gender, and class. And so when I was reintroduced to astrology, roughly around 21, 22 years old, well, we'll say 22, I had all those other things that I hadn't processed related to astrology. Plus, I didn't understand the mechanics, coupled with, everything for me was race, gender, and class in terms of the dynamics of our society. So astrology made no sense. But I had a Gemini friend who I had a crush on, an older woman, way older. But when you're young and you're a young man, you think that you can just kind of, secure any woman, right? But she befriended me and she was very kind to me and not dismissive. And she was very into astrology. And she's like, I told her what I thought about astrology and being on the quote unquote cusp. And I said, if I had to choose between the arachnid, the scorpion, and the centaur, clearly I'm a centaur, right? And she's like, no, I
Right.
think you're the bug. And I was like, long story
I
shorter.
love it.
Long story shorter, I happened upon an astrologer who offered to give me a reading, for a fee, but I had the cash. And, within the first 15 minutes, he said things, you met me, I'm short. And so he said some things like, it looks like something happened in utero with your mom. And I was like, that's not hard math, Chief. I'm 4'11". I didn't say that. My mom was a Libra, so she raised me right. But in my head, I'm like, okay, is this the best this guy has? And he's going on. And then he also started with saying like, well, your sun is like 29 degrees of Scorpio. So you're a Scorpio. So I was already pissed off.
Right.
So I was like, okay. Because I'm like, okay, I'm
as
not
a
the
Scorpio
centaur.
would be.
Right. And then he starts, after, he said, oh, it seems like you're pretty bright. And I, to myself, again, I said, well, I told you I was in a PhD program. Chances are I'm not an idiot. So, what's this? But then he did it. And what he did is then he started talking about the dynamics between, he's like, it seems like some issue would happen in utero between your brother, like a sibling and your father and then your mom. And, that may have complicated the pregnancy. How did you know that? And he's like, he went into it. He was like, look at, I'm looking at your Mercury square to your Jupiter. None of that made sense to me, but that was exactly correct. And I had just learned that 2 months before.
Wow.
And so when he said that, my Scorpio cool veneer broke. I was like, well, how do you know that? Blah, blah, blah. It's like, I think I even asked him, like, who have you been talking to? Because I was like, I haven't said that to anybody. So I don't know how he knew that. And I had gotten other readings before, but beyond guesswork. Well, the last leg of the story, and then it becomes more the study of astrology, is that for some reason I was talking to another person in my my housing complex, someone I didn't even know very well, about my experience with the astrologer. And she said, well, I'm into astrology. I'm like, cool. Well, maybe I can borrow books from you or something because I want to understand what this is. And then on the lark, I asked her, well, when's your birthday? November 22nd? November 22nd, when? November 22nd, 1967? And I was like, we have the same birthday. And I was like, that's weird. I was like, okay. And I think I had enough respect at that time, even though I was an atheist, for omens that I was like, something's going on here. So I borrowed her books, then eventually got my own books. What's interesting about that part of the story is that there was a reversal. She became a fundamentalist Christian and renounced astrology. She was a moon in Cancer. I'm a moon in Leo, same day, same sun. But she
Wow.
went the other way, and I proceeded to become the astrologer. I mean, I went through the certifications. I mean, I spent 10 years trying to kick astrology in the teeth. Even as I would do readings for people, not charging or anything, just friends, and more so just waiting for the other shoe to fall and for someone to say, like, that doesn't make any sense. Yes, I know it, but no one ever said that. So that's kind of in a nutshell, that trajectory of how I became an astrologer.
That's so interesting. The move from being an evangelical, from being a preacher to now being one of the most respected astrologers of our time. And I can say that as someone who really respects your work and admires you. And also, I regularly have clients and students come to me and they'll say, I've studied with Sam. I know Sam. And everyone that approaches me, or that somehow I find out that they're a student of yours or they've had readings with you, every one of them has this understanding of astrology that I think is aligns with mine, number one, but also it is deep. It's not just,
thank you,
cookie cutter. So I think one of the things that I appreciate about your approach to astrology is that it's very realistic. It's very practical. And you have a way of explaining some of the transits that are happening, or some of what is taking place in the world, and relating it to the cosmos in a way that's poetic, and in a way also that gives us a sense of relief, not relief as in like blind hope, but relief as in, okay, now this makes sense. Now I can see what's unfolding and find some deeper meaning for what's happening. I wanted to have you on the show today because I think a lot of people are looking at the politics of the US right now and looking at the global phenomenons that are taking place and wondering what's happening, what's going on, how can we gain some context for it, how can we find meaning for it, and what do we do to prepare for what's coming up. With that said, I was hoping that we could just spend a few minutes talking about the results of the election, the outcome of the election. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about the astrology of that moment.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you for all the kind words you just said to me. I received them.
It's heartfelt. I don't say things I don't mean. I mean, I'm a Libra, so sometimes I do, but not when I'm giving a compliment.
No, that's what I respect about you. You're a straight arrow, and you put your hands and your heart, where your money is and what you believe. That's why I was rooting for you in office.
Thank you. Thank you.
No, that's awesome. So, and considering that you're in politics now yourself, and I was raised in a political family, meaning my father never held office. My mom was a Democratic, committee chairperson, not in the national level, but in the local level, back in the day where there was more local organization that we had in the Democratic Party. And I'm mentioning this because there's a couple of tributaries that inform my thoughts related to this election. One, I always stay observant of cultural trends, political trends, listening to various sources. Like I listened to Ben Shapiro for 3 years. Now, I listened to him because I wanted to understand from someone who I saw as intelligent is the landscape of the Republican, mentality, or the conservative, as better said, the conservative mentality. And I learned a lot. There was a lot I gained. And then from that, I was looking at the prism of what had been happening over the last, 4 years. And one of the things that I was very, I guess, attentive to was the anger that people felt and put on the Biden administration. The Biden-Harris administration. And I don't think that's talked about enough. Not just in terms of immigration, which surfaced more so as Saturn went into Pisces. I anticipated that. When Saturn goes into... So one advantage that Trump had, just a little brief excursion, one advantage that Trump had in 2016 and he had in 2024, which concerned me, because just to be clear about my politics, I'm not a Trumper. I won't say that, I'm, all for Harris and everything, but more of a moderate in that sense. But I'm not like a diehard Trumper or something like that, even though I did predict Trump to win among my students and other folks.
Mm-hmm.
But the advantage that Trump had is that Saturn was in a Jupiter sign in 2016 in Sagittarius. And again, Saturn was in a Jupiter sign for 2024. And that usually brings up issues related to boundaries and borders. And so I anticipated that if I were working for the Republican Party as an astrologer, I would say like, oh, you'll have great success talking about borders and boundaries and immigration, which is what that's what the party did. But I think a lot of people were still upset about COVID mandates, even though Trump implemented some himself. But they put that largely on Biden as he carried forward with his agenda into 2021 and beyond. So I think there was still a lot of that foment. As far as the astrology, now this is where, I don't know if you saw my live on IG or other things I've been talking about. I don't know if I pay as much attention to transits related to candidates. I'm not convinced that this works consistently. Because a lot of people felt, oh, Jupiter's in Gemini. Kamala is a Gemini rising. She's going to win. How about Trump being a Gemini?
Right.
Well, no, he's okay. So I don't think that's going to work the way you think it's going to work for you or for her.
Right.
What I find works, because there's a difference between natal astrology and looking at someone's progressions and solar arcs and mundane astrology. And mundane astrology works with this idea that the individual, the natus, is a subsumption to a larger whole. And so you need to kind of relate that to something that has happened on a mundane level. So an ingress chart, an Aries, Libra ingress chart, or the other ingresses for the solstices, or looking at the inauguration chart for George Washington for the first U.S. president, or you're going to be looking at one of the many U.S. charts that we can get into. Or this is a weaker one, but some people have used it, where they used the first voting polling place in New Hampshire as the starting point. I think that's a weaker one because now we're early voting. Why? Why am I going to rely on that particular day, with, the New Hampshire polling? So I think the other 3 or 4 before that one has a lot more credence. So I had looked at the ingress chart, the Aries ingress, and it had a fixed angle, which means that you don't have to look at the Libra ingress. And it didn't look well for the Democratic Party. I mean, Joe Biden specifically, because at that particular point in March, it was Joe Biden who was running and, being primaried, but it was Kamala who stepped forward. And I think there were a lot of things that were challenging for her. Getting a campaign up in 3 months, I think, on a national level was difficult. I think some of the messaging was off. They didn't have time to hone the messaging in terms of the clarity. She lost a lot of people related to some dimensions of the Palestine conflict, and other things. And just not dealing with the anger, from men. We're going to talk about this with all the Aries activity coming up. But someone needs to talk and check in on the boys. Not that we don't need to kind of talk about women, but I think there are some problems related to the boys and then also with the women, and also, to be specific, the white boys and the white women, the white men and the white women, because a lot of blame is going around like, what happened with the Latinos? What happened with the blacks? I'm like, okay, listen, stop. Those demographics are sure and true, right? That they changed. But it went from 53% to 56% of white women going for Trump this time, right? So, why are you coming for them?
Right.
So, that's my take on the different confluence of things that go with that.
Yeah, I think that's a really astute analysis, because when you look at the Democratic National Convention, it was full of, I mean, it was like a party. It was really fun to watch. I was thinking, wouldn't this be great if this were the next 4 years? But what was obviously missing was the grief around Palestine. What was obviously missing was a talk about inflation. And even though that doesn't have anything to do with Biden's policies, or, that inflation's a separate issue, that there's still people are still feeling the pressure of those things that are hanging out in the air, being unspoken. So I think you're right about the Aries North Node, and how we needed to bring in the pain, the anger, the grief, and really make that more of a talking point, and put that in
not just the rah. I think, and I this is a I haven't said this publicly, so I don't know. It's like, well, why are you going to say it on my show?
And we can edit it if you change your, if you
okay.
Please say it. I want to hear it.
I'm a Scorpio. I don't say anything that I don't mean to say on some level. Oh. But what I'm going to say too is that, well, I did say it on Twitter once. I think the Democrats kind of relied on old templates, whether running on the revised hope idea from Obama of 2008. And I definitely wouldn't have used "I'm with her" as another, I'm like, that's cursed. Not literally.
Yeah.
And this is nothing against women, right? Yeah. I got it, but I was just like, I wouldn't have touched that with it. Just thinking, my background when I did undergrad was public relations. From a public relations point of view, I wouldn't have used "I'm with her." Not because, I think it just was loaded, a loaded phrase from 2016. And, like, why evoke that? Something else. I mean, I think that wasn't the main one. I know. I mean, a lot of different, and that was the other problem. There were a lot of different ones that floated around as versus, a clear slogan that encapsulated what that campaign was about.
Speaking of the contrast between "I'm with her" and what we're seeing now, so many of the friends that I'm talking to, we're all talking about how this, as Trump is filling his cabinet right now, it feels like we're in Ken world. If you've seen the Barbie movie, have you seen the Barbie movie?
Did.
Sam? Okay, yeah, it feels like we're in Ken's world right now, and I think that this kind of relates to how we're moving into a Mars retrograde period, how we had the Mars-Pluto opposition during during the election season. And you think that any of this sort of polarity, if you will between the anger, men's anger, between women's issues, do you think that any of that is going to carry over into 2025 with Mars retrograde, with Mars and Leo?
Absolutely.
Mars. Okay. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I think absolutely it will. I mean, because it's been festering for a while and it's needed to happen. I've been tracking this for at least on my own a decade. So I don't see any reason why it would, desist. I think it will change. So I'm actually excited about Trump's picks. Headline.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Wait, hold on. Before anyone gets, thinking like, I thought you said you're not a Trumper. No. So one thing I remember, and you probably do remember, or you've heard of it, is the Peter Principle, where people rise to their level of incompetence.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, I love that. Yes. Okay. I know where you're going with this now. Okay, go ahead.
One thing I'm excited about is watching all these people who I think are ill-fitted for the positions that they've been given or that they will be confirmed for, rise to them. And then, obviously we don't want to look forward to the fallout and the failure because it could have repercussions for everyday people. But anyone who's observed Trump, because one other thing I want to say is I watched The Apprentice, the movie about Trump's Saturn return and his nodal reversal at 27, 29, the night before the election. And that was purposeful because I was like, I want to know a little more, even though I know it's going to be like cinematic and a lot filled in as any biopic And it was very good. I mean, I could talk about the astrology of Sebastian Stan, who played Trump, but I don't want to get too off topic. One of the things that I learned is that, he learned from his master, Trump, learned from Roy Cohn. And what happens is that because they get in this same idea of prompting people rising to their, to their level of incompetence, is that there's a lot of fallout, falling out with people. Look at Rudy Giuliani, nowhere to be seen.
Right.
He's a broken man. So
and Michael Cohen and you could
all of them.
Everyone,
even no one who was spared.
Nikki Haley was in his,
And he crushed her, and now she's like off on her own, and she, being a wise, smart woman, saying like, no, there's nothing I want in a Trump office, so she's not taking anything as far as yet. But all these different people rising to these particular positions, what we know are two things: they are likely not competent for them, and by virtue of that, they are likely to fail or not be very good. That which was true for his last administration, because he's rewarding loyalty rather than, competency.
Yeah.
And then the second thing is that these people usually have a falling out with Trump and then fall off the edge of the planet on some level.
Right. So or get arrested or go to jail.
Or get arrested or jail. So these are people I'm like, Tulsi Gabbard, bye, babe. See you later. Right. Marco Rubio. All right. Yeah, man. Yeah. Here you go. Bye.
Matt Gaetz.
Yeah. All right, man. Yeah. Okay. Oh, you skated away from that, but you're going right toward the pit. So, all these people kind of rising. I'm like, good. That's great. Because I know what happens to you guys. I mean, we have empirical data.
Yeah.
That you guys all kind of fail. Yes, you're absolutely right. In fact, it's so funny. I went to an event with Caroline Casey a couple of weeks ago. And one thing that she has all these, these quotables, these like tweetable moments. And one of the things that she said was, tyranny sows the seeds of its own demise. And when you look at the way that this is all unfolding and his relationships with these other very power hungry men, Putin, Elon Musk, Netanyahu, I mean, you can sort of see the handwriting on the wall, and you can see that these egos left unchecked are going to just compete with one another. And so tyranny will sow the seeds of its own demise. Yeah.
And people are going to get hurt in the process. People are going to.
Are. I mean, I'm not making too light of that. I mean, the fallout will hurt people. What's his name? T-Rex. I call him T-Rex, who was the Secretary of State for a little bit. He left the diplomatic corps a mess.
Yes.
And so, Marco Rubio likely will do the same, and trying to be tough with Ukraine, or, also in terms of his commitment related to Israel and Palestine and things like that. But I think ultimately, they're going to rise to the level of incompetence.
Yeah.
There's not one person I've seen him nominate who I felt like, oh, they have a record in this. They have a history. Right. There's some, training. I'm just like, and I know some progressives, liberals are very sad and, hurt and, feeling like, justice hasn't been served. But like you just said, I think, he may be sowing the seeds for his own demise.
Yeah. 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 And, I think that I think in terms of, in a lot of the communities that I'm in, and I'm talking about both the local communities and I'm involved in a lot of obviously county-wide, regional types of movements and organizations. I connect with other council members and other people who are involved locally throughout California. And we're talking about what do we do to create a resistance movement to what is going to be happening with mass deportation, with the lack of access to abortion rights in other places, tariffs and the effects or the implications of that. And so, I think on a hopeful message, there are enough people who are really committed to local movements and to working within their communities, that I think that there's going to be that's where really we're going to be leaning, where more and more that's where the power is. That's where we can affect the most change. And I think that relates to Pluto and Aquarius. So I was wondering if you wanted to speak about any of that.
Oh no, I've been talking about this. I mean, one of the things I will applaud the Republican Party on doing, and is that they actually depend on and cultivate more real world in-person connections. Whether we're talking about CPAC, where they have their annual conference where they meet, or is it biannual, where they meet to talk about conservative issues, and then, where Trump and other appears, but it's in person and they meet. I don't know what the Democratic equivalent is.
Yeah.
And I think that becomes important. I mean, that's a national level, but I think what they do is also cultivate, Trump never stopped his rallies.
Right. Yeah.
And meeting in person, because then, you sit next to people and you start talking, and it builds relationships.
Yeah.
And I think the key thing that the Democratic Party progressives have to learn is building genuine relationships even more in person, because we developed as a species over millions of years through in-person contact. Yeah. All this through media, whether that's been letters over the last 200-300 years, and then, postal services, to now electronic services, all that's epiphenomenon to our history and our evolution. So it's dealing with pheromones, it's dealing with, how someone smells, how all these different things that are conditioned related to our evolution. And so I think it becomes important to have more in-person discussions, meetings, discussion groups, actions, all these particular things. I also think we need to have a conversation about action and what particular actions we're going to take. And one of the things I'm going to say, because I was in New York for Occupy Wall Street, and one of the things I think you may or may not know, I've spent 20 years studying policing and the police.
Oh, I didn't know that. Huh.
And for ESAR, I even did a talk on the astrology of policing and looking at the history of
Sam, did you know that I did that too? I actually wrote a book in 2002 about mass incarceration.
No.
Yeah, I was very involved in advocacy efforts in where I lived in St. Louis. I worked on a documentary about children with incarcerated mothers. That's how my whole career started, working really on the front lines, doing some lobbying, participating with other organizations, working with formerly incarcerated women for 2 years.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That's great. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's interesting. I didn't know that about you, so that I was like, oh wow, we have that same background.
Well, I got Venus in Libra, South Node in Libra, so I have a thing about justice as well. So,
wow. Oh, cool. Okay, so tell me more.
The thing that I learned in watching Occupy Wall Street in New York at Zuccotti Park, that I think becomes important for us to start thinking about how we do particular actions, is that the establishment, we'll put it that way, does not care about our protester making a statement.
Right.
What they're thinking about is not so much even public safety, but public control. And so, now you can't even, really have a rally, or you can't even have without even some measure of a permit, which seems weird to me. As, aspect of civil disobedience.
Yeah.
But one of the things that we're going to have to learn is that, just kind of making a statement without a plan of either coalescing, more people, bringing more people in, or having a way in which you bring people in, just kind of, walking the street like, oh, we will not go, power to the people, without also on canvassing, hey, you want to learn more, pamphlets and other things handed out. I'm just going to say it, and it's probably not generous, but it just seems dumb and it's ineffective. Yeah. You're just making a statement to people who don't care. Right. When I say don't care, I'm talking about the establishment. They're
Right,
not
right,
threatened.
right.
They learned that from the 60s. And so how that relates to policing is that we are going to have, if we start talking about actual actions and, fostering more genuine connections, more training, which I think also is something that's gone the way of the dodo in terms of civil action. Those in the 60s, 70s, whether we're talking about for civil rights for Black people, but also in terms of queer folks, they were trained.
Mm-hmm.
They went to camps. Yeah. They kind of were educated related to that. So the next level is, I'm going to say this, and it's going to appear on your podcast, but I think it's important to get the message out. One way in which you break the police is make them work harder. And the way you make them work harder is that you don't put yourself in one damn park where they can corral you all in one place and then take you down, which is what they did.
Mm-hmm.
You have to think militarily, multiple arenas of conflict.
Wow.
The more that the police are stretched thin, especially since they're a mercenary force to be paid, the more that they're going to have complications. But it doesn't seem like we deal with this asymmetry in our actions and our protests. So I think if we're going to get serious, and I think it is, and the police are going to rise to the occasion, of course. They may come with more weapons and all that, but there are more of us than there are of them. And I think we're going to have to, if we get to the point, and we may, with this administration, get to the point that we're going to be willing to do more, especially as Neptune's going to Aries, Uranus is in Gemini, we're going to have to get inventive. And not only inventive, but willing to do whatever it takes. Yeah. And I don't know if that's been the American polity. I think it's like, well, I want my cake and eat it too. I want to be able to have my, newest iPhone and my newest things and whatever. Yeah. We may have to recognize that, we may have to go without or have to exchange some things among each other or be able to supply more to another person, creating these different aspects of community. Dig into our pockets deeper.
You referenced Neptune and Aries and you referenced Uranus and Gemini. And I've talked about these two ingresses on my show quite a bit. Do you have a vision for what that's going to look like in terms of our collective consciousness, in terms of some of these movements and activism that we're talking about?
Yeah, because I didn't mention the other one, which is Saturn and Aries.
Yes.
And I have that. So I'm going toward my Saturn return.
Oh, congratulations.
Well, thank you. Still, I take it day by day. We'll see how I get there next year. But it'll be the beginning of it. So Saturn and Aries, I think, is fairly draconian. Saturn has lost the graces of his exaltation in Libra. So he thinks might is right. And he doesn't realize that his power is also drawn from consensus and from the dynamic one has with others. And so he attributes too much to himself. Those are lessons I've had to learn with my Saturn and Aries. And I think that is true for many Saturn and Aries, what we're working on. And for the Uranus and Gemini, the concern is that the United States has never not been at war when Uranus has been in Gemini. And so I think we may be drawn into a conflict, and most of our population has not experienced the United States in an embroiled, challenging conflict. You're like, well, no, we had Iraq, and we had, the Gulf War, the two Gulf Wars, our generation remembers the two Gulf Wars, right? With the Bushes.
Right. Yes, exactly.
But, I think this next war, whether it's a quote unquote civil war or whether it becomes, something overseas or both, I think is different, of a different tenor. And I'm not apocalyptic about it, nor do I, subscribe to the end of the world.
Right.
But difficult times, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because the end of the world, we have to also realize, is a real thing in localities and particularities. So the end of the world has happened in Ukraine for Ukrainians. The end of the world has happened for Palestinians in Gaza.
Right.
In Ramallah, all these particular places, it is a real thing for them.
Yeah.
but the universal aspect of it. So we have to kind of broaden our understanding and our sympathy and our relationship to the end of the world. Because, we largely in the United States have been safe from particular aspects of conflict. That could be a challenging time. Neptune in Aries, I think, brings in a certain level of boldness and vision. There were a lot of people who were born with Neptune in Aries who dreamt the 20th century, during the last time. So they brought a whole different vision of what was possible.
Yeah.
And I think that is important, that we could think about, possibilities. So I think allowing ourselves to dream and envision new ways of being, new ways of doing things, all the Martian things, I think is the gift. And I like to think cyclically. What I've been saying for a long time in being, my scorpionic veiled way, when I talk to people who have the Uranus-Neptune conjunction, I often say to them, like, oh, you're the rebuilders. And they get excited. They're like, oh, yeah, blah, blah, blah. But very few have ever paused to ask, like, rebuilding what? What happened? Right.
Right.
And so I think the thing to understand is that there will be some rebuilding that may need to happen. I think there's some infrastructures that may fall apart. I don't know if the UN is going to hold together, but maybe something better, a UN or some other kind of international organization that has actual teeth emerges from the ashes, just like the League of Nations or the UN emerged from the League of Nations.
Yes.
So I think we're, I don't want anyone to think like, oh, we're just going into negative times. I don't think that. I think that it is going to be more so difficult times that, presage better times. One last thing I want to say related to all the Aries, we have Chiron in Aries, we have Neptune and going into Aries, we're going to have Saturn in Aries. And so we need to talk about men. We need to talk about the boys, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Men have been struggling about their sense of place for decades. And figuring out or trying to figure out how they fit into this world that isn't just conditioned on their brute strength or just relying on, them having certain advantages related to education, which is why some of it, they want to bring some of it back, right? It's like, well, I want you off the pill, which was liberating for all women.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
I want to reduce your reproductive rights, because I want you to have my children and be home and barefoot and in the kitchen. And they may not say it that way. But, it was everything that was in their advantage. Me is, I'm not disparaging marriage because I was married and would like to be married again, but marriage is an advantage for men.
It is.
I know you're married to a woman, so I'm not saying that, it isn't, but it was an institution largely created for the benefit of men.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because wives took on so much of the emotional labor and the unpaid labor of a relationship. I know, even though I have a wife, sometimes we say, gosh, I really wish we had a wife, like who wouldn't benefit from having a wife?
Right.
I love my wife, but we have a very equal, balanced relationship.
Right.
Don't mean to bring in stereotypes, but I think what you're saying with as women, more and more women over the generations have gone into the workforce, have broken away from that heteronormative paradigm, that it really has changed the dynamic for all relationships, but women have been able to locate themselves within that and men haven't. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, that is what I'm saying.
Okay.
Or they've had some difficulty. And so they want to go back to a certain sensibility of it. And I think some of it can make sense. Some of it will not make sense.
Right.
And when I mean like, well, what do you think makes sense? Well, I think the idea that we can have flexibility, like where it can be like, it's okay for a woman to earn more than their man, and not think for the man thinking that he's lesser of a man for that. And that, or if he is going to be more responsible for taking care of the home and all those things, that he's a lesser of a man. It's kind of acknowledging, okay, yeah, maybe you might want to have more of a traditional household, but it's okay to have other households as well. And I think some men feel threatened by that and they need to get over it. And that, it's harder than to say, just get over it. I think there's kind of more this rebellion. There's some women who are struggling with that, and they're like, well, wait, there's this man who's making six figures or maybe high six figures, who's willing to tell me that I can stay home and I don't have to go to work. But you're telling me that's a compromising of my femininity? Girl, you look broke. I'm going with that. And so they want to have that. So I think it's acknowledging that there can be some flexibility without either one being absolute truth.
I think that is something that is going to really start to be a talking point. I think that's something that we're really going to look at with Saturn and Neptune moving into Aries. There's a whole new paradigm shift. And when Saturn and Neptune meet up at 0 degrees Aries, that's a reset for everybody. And I think we'll feel that in our relationships. And I think you're right about us really needing to have space to talk about the gender polarities in all the ways they express themselves, in the ways that if you look at the way that we've experienced polarity, you can tie back some of the environmental issues that we have by looking at gender polarity and gender injustice. So many of the justice related problems that we have to do with sexism and misogyny. And I think that that's something that we're going to have to bring up and bring out into the open over the next several years.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the things I love about our field, about astrology, is that it's a petri dish for what has and is happening in the larger community. But what do you mean, Sam? Well, if you go back 100 years, literally, to sometime, 1924, largely when you did encounter astrology anywhere in the world, it was the province of men.
Right.
Which I find fascinating, when, bros kind of step forward and like, well, astrology is for women and, only women are, suckers for it. And I'm like, this is your way of telling me you've not studied any history. How do you tell me you haven't studied any history without telling me that you haven't studied any history? And that's kind of one key way, because anyone who's studied history would know, like, largely dominated by men and has been, in some level still is. One of the great things about you having been an author, I think with a couple books out related to astrology, is that we have a growing number of women who are publishing, where largely it has been the province for, even now, it's still a lot of men. There's still a good number of men speaking at conferences. But there's an increasing number of women who are arriving in leadership positions in astrological organizations, who are also more the speakers, and then a growing number who are becoming the authors. So astrology is kind of mirroring this shift that's happening, that likely will also happen in a larger society. And one of the fascinating things in terms of talking about also misogyny is that as much as this country, our country heralds and trumpets for equal rights and the idea of women, we're behind in other parts of the world. A lot of people talk about Islamic countries, and as a Muslim, I'm going to be attentive to, Islamic countries. They talk about, they kind of mistreat women, and some of them do, like Afghanistan definitely does. Saudi Arabia is doing a little better, but definitely has. But, other countries like Pakistan and other places have elected women as their leaders. Which, the United States still has not done.
Yes. Right. Yeah.
So I think, it's something to learn, even that in the hardened places where we think misogyny is rampant, there are places where people still trust women related to leadership.
Yeah.
Now, astrology, we've gotten more, and I think it's going to happen even more. We're going to see more women involved already. We see them, there's a lot of women at conferences, more women than men.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, it's going to also be important to kind of strike that balance. And, that's where society can head.
I love that. So I have just one more question. I think we've talked a lot about interconnectedness. We've talked a lot about local community. We talked a lot about, we've covered a lot of bases today. But I was wondering, do you see astrology playing a role in bringing people together, in helping us feel interconnected, helping us feel more connected to the earth, more connected to one another?
Yes, but I think it's going to require some shifts on our part. I mean, when I say our part, I mean for we as astrologers. And what kind of shifts do I envision? One, I think it means that astrologers become a little more willing to talk about culture and aspects of culture with a lot more of an informed nuance. You're like, well, what do you mean by that? Well, I think it's going to be important for us to start listening to the variety of opinions and thoughts that are trickling in or streaming into our community. So, for instance, the confusion that ensued in 2020 when one particular astrologer, who we both know and both love,
yes,
who, images of George Floyd's murder,
right,
and how that affected people, really comes from this encounter where we have people who are very familiar with the violence that occurs to George Floyd, who didn't, as this astrologer said, need to be woken up. And I think that is just a kind of a microcosm of how we start to talk about culture and cultures with a lot more informed opinions. That means listening. And one of the things you were going to ask me, and we could talk about it, my talk at NORWAC.
Yes. Yes. I loved your talk.
Thank you. If I were born on Mars, I referred to John Michael Greer's work in a remarkable book called The Twilight of Pluto.
Yes.
And in that book, he argues that our discoveries of planets seem to correlate with cultural shifts or cultural understanding, starting from the traditional visible seven to the invisible ones. And his argument with Pluto is that Pluto became this symbol of going against cosmos, which is the inherent nature of beauty, in order. And so in shattering it. So that came with all the violent, semi-violent aspects of thought that crept up in the 20th century that correlates with the discovery of Pluto.
Right. Which
and
we're talking about. We're talking about the nuclear bomb. We're talking about the
Freudian analysis and kind of the splitting of, it's kind of looking at how things divide rather than how things unify.
Yeah, that's a really, really beautiful way of putting that.
And I think what he's saying with the twilight of Pluto, with Pluto's demotion, he's arguing, whether that will prove true or not, he's arguing that this might be a path back to unity. Because one of the things he says is that we've been here before, like everyone's all up in their, whatever about, the demotion of Pluto without recognizing that happened to Ceres. It happened to Black Moon Lilith when we thought we had discovered it. It happened to Juno. It happened to what we call all the asteroids.
Yeah.
Right. They were all demoted. They once were listed and taught to school children as being part of our solar system until they weren't.
Yes. And Eris too, around that time.
Right. No, so he's kind of bringing to our consciousness that, how we talk about the planets becomes reflective of how we talk about ourselves. And I think that also requires us looking at the sky and listening to each other. Demetra George likes to say, what's in the sky is in the psyche. And I love that phraseology because I think it's so true.
Good. Yeah.
And I think it is important for us to start talking about it, you complimented me on talking about very tangible, practical ways. Reason why I do that is because of my history as an atheist.
Mm-hmm.
And then going into astrology as a skeptic. It's kind of like, well, why is that true? What makes that true? And what can truth mean in some way that helps people in their lives? And why I'm mentioning this point is that, for a long time, we talked about things that were more intangible, like being in touch with the collective unconscious, or, understanding your past lives. Well, Chick, tell me how to live in this life, right? I'm not saying to you,
Right.
Chick.
Yeah.
I'm just saying
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
general.
Yeah.
Right? It's kind of like, well, we've gotten so airy without talking about people's needs and recognizing where they're coming from and listening.
Mm-hmm.
When I read astrology books, especially from the 20th century, a lot of them were so heavy into, psychological language and trying to kind of come into the mainstream through psychology. I don't know what they're talking about. I mean, I do intellectually,
Mm-hmm.
but, it's kind of like, as you get in touch with the collective unconscious as it comes to the archetype of Mars in the 11th house, and you register how you deal with your fierceness, you're better able to navigate in the social order. Chick,
Mm-hmm.
what? What does that mean?
Right. Yeah.
Can I make friends?
Which I think is one of the values of this rise in traditional techniques and Hellenistic astrology, and even some of the ways that Vedic astrology and Vedic techniques have interwoven with Western astrology. It has gotten more grounded in our everyday experiences.
I think one of the dark side that has crept in is that a lot of young people or newer people come into astrology with an eye on making a buck, and this is a way to kind of, get fans or whatever. And they haven't studied astrology. They haven't done the work. And I don't mean it has to go that you have to go through certifications. I think the usefulness of certification, whether that's through NCGR, OPA, or ESAR, CAP ESAR, is that it becomes a test of what you think you know and what you don't know. But it doesn't become a validation for you as an astrologer. You don't need that to be an astrologer. But I do think it's important to have an education in astrology and to study it.
Right.
And, like, well, no, I've read books. I read that book by, Rachel Lang. So I've read her books. Why can't I be an astrologer? Because it's not just about Rachel's books or Chris's books, or even when I publish my book, it's going to be more so, rounding out your education, because you're talking about almost 3,000 years of a vast knowledge of history.
Yes, right.
And
right.
How we've been observing the sky.
On that note, do you have any courses coming up? Do you have any offerings that you'd like to tell our listeners about?
Sure, and I can send you the links. So I'm teaming up with 3 other Santa Fe astrologers January 4th to talk about the astrology of 2025. So that's Lindsay Turner, Michael Bartlett, and Jonah Emerson Bell, who are all on Instagram and, well, I think on Twitter, but not as active on Twitter. Twitter is going through its own moment right now. But we're going to do that, and it's going to be a hybrid. We're doing it in person, but we're also doing it via Zoom, so people can join us via Zoom as well.
Fantastic.
And I guess, I'll have another round of Nitty Gritty 2, probably starting in January, February of 2025. And then for WASA, which is the Washington State Astrological Association, I'm really excited about a lecture I'm going to be doing called The Astrology of Enemies. They're going to promote it on their site. So just kind of do a Google of Washington State Astrological Association. They don't have it on their website yet, but it'll be up for 2025. And then there's NORWAC. I'll be at NORWAC giving the keynote speech, this time on Ophiuchus. And then also giving a lecture. Yeah,
I love that.
I'm going to tackle Ophiuchus finally and give my thoughts on it. We talked about interstellar astrology. Now we're going to go into the thing that most astrologers hate.
And just for reference, for anybody who doesn't know what we're talking about, every couple of years, an article goes around about how NASA discovers a 13th sign. So is that what you're
That's
what
the
you're going
13th
to
sign.
be?
Mm-hmm.
Yep, exactly. And all of us astrologers get DMs and get messages like, "Oh my gosh, am I still a Scorpio?" Yes, you're still a Scorpio. So okay, good. Ooh, that'll be very interesting.
Yeah, so you can reach me at unlockastrology.com, and then you could look up Unlock Astrology at YouTube, and then you'll find that talk that I did on life if I were born on Mars. And then also on Twitter, I'm still on Twitter at Unlock Astrology, all one word. But on Instagram, where I guess I'll appear more, and same for Threads, it's going to be S as in Sam, F as in Fred, Reynolds, SF Reynolds, on Threads and Instagram.
All right. So everyone go and check it out. And yeah, thank you. Sam, I like to leave everybody with a cosmic call to action. It's kind of like their homework assignment for integrating some of the concepts and some of the astrology of this moment that we've talked about today into their everyday lives. So putting things into action. And do you have any cosmic call to action that you would like to leave our listeners with?
Yeah. So I actually can supply two, but they're related. One,
great.
Mend a relationship, meaning reach out to someone with whom you've had some measure of, mild aversion, nothing traumatic. So I'm not encouraging anyone to be in contact with someone who is, traumatically hurt them. So that's not what I'm saying. But where you've had a misunderstanding, where you've had, maybe even some public distress, in terms of conversations, see if you can get on the phone or on a Zoom or on a FaceTime and be willing to talk, because kind of just relying on the web, a lot can get lost in translation or text. And this is not just about Mercury being in the shadow or retrograde. It's kind of doing the work of, mending fences, the broken fences that we have in the United States or abroad or beyond. The other thing I would say is be careful first about reacting. Listen, and not just think about what you're going to say or your counterpoint, but cultivate this curiosity. So if someone says, Trump is the greatest president that we've ever had, your uncle, at Thanksgiving dinner, listen and ask, well, why do you think that? What prompts that? And not listen like, well, I want to hear the facts. What's the data? What is your uncle, for instance, saying in between the words? Is your uncle saying someone I see myself in him? Is he someone I look up to because he's been rich and your uncle has felt like a failure? And realize that in that moment, as you're listening and you might be hearing that, then be prepared to pivot and say so you see yourself in him and you could imagine your success like his success. And so do you think he's going to be able to help you with your success? Or do you think there's a way I can help you with your success? So it becomes a way to look for entry points for each other's humanity.
I love that.
Rather than trying to be right. One thing a friend said to me years ago that stuck with me, people want to be right more than they want to be loved. Well, learn to be loved and love.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. I've had so many conversations with people not wanting to go home for the holidays because of the political differences. So that's a great cosmic call to action. But I really thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you so much for this important, insightful conversation. And thank you just for the work that you do in the world and for being one of the pioneers in our field, one of the leaders in our field. It's great it's great to know you, and it's great to have these conversations with you.
Thank you, Rachel. And you keep doing the work you're doing.
All right. I'm back for one more reminder that we gave you a lot of information. So don't forget to check out the show notes. You can look down below and find Sam at unlockastrology.com. You can also find me at rachellangastrologer.com. And don't forget to sign up for my Shift Network course and empower your psychic mediumship through astrology. I also wanted to give a huge shout out to my team at Podify. And if you are wanting to start a podcast, or if you're thinking about it, even maybe you've just like been feeling the rumblings of something inside, check them out. Podify.com. They are incredible. A one-stop shop, as I like to say, for all things production. And if you like this quality of the show, if you like the content of the show, then go check them out and see how they can help you. All right, everyone. That's all I have. Thank you, thank you, thank you.